watching your best friend drowning, and it would just seem hysterical. But the other side of this is that, in theory, one could neurologically eliminate the very possibility of humour, so that we find absolutely everything extremely serious.
Yeah.
Realistically, I don't think we need to do this at all. One of the reasons I lay such stress on information-sensitive gradients of well-being is that if you're a naturally extremely serious person, then simply ratcheting up your hedonic set point and hedonic range won't inject unwanted levity. Or, on the other hand, if you're a natural comedian and don't want to lose your sense of fun and joie de vivre, neither will waking up in the morning in an exceptionally good mood somehow cause you to lose your sense of humour. I mean, the wonderful thing about ratcheting up hedonic set points is that it's not asking you to give up your own values and preference architecture in favour of mine or anyone else's, unless that is you're opposed in principle to this kind of recalibration.
Okay, so no, I think that's very important. So what you just said is that, like, a lot of humor has to do with our fears, right? When we accidentally get very close to one of our fears, that's incredibly funny, often. So suppose that there was no pain anymore in the world, so we had many fewer fears. Would humor still be as good? You're saying that it would be.
Well, why is it that there are far more male comedians than female comedians? To take an evolutionary perspective, in one way it's a form of signalling one's superior genetic fitness if one is a male who can make people laugh. And so, though humour can seem to be very benign, it's a deadly serious skill or adaptation from an evolutionary point of view. It's a bit of a wild card, humour. I don't think it's well understood. It's really well understood in any deep sense. It's just that, yes, essentially one will be able to control how funny one finds life in future at a very fine-grained level.
Yeah. No, well, I think that's very encouraging. So you think we could get rid of pain and still have the same sense of humor that incorporates the pain that used to be in our lives but isn't there anymore somehow?
Yes, in some sense, this is it. That hedonic dips can play the same role as pain and suffering does now, as far as we know. And it's regrettable, I think, that there haven't been more studies of these genetic outliers. You mentioned Anders Sandberg, a very lovable guy.
Yes,
can
he
actually
is.
say something like, I do have a ridiculously high hedonic set point. And he has a keen sense of humour, he's fabulously productive.
And he has a fan page.
Yes,
So he has a Facebook fan page, which is very impressive. Yeah.
But this is it. You don't need. This is it. It's possible to have a high hedonic set point and have a very different character. In the news recently has been Jo Cameron. This is this Scottish woman, retired vegan school teacher, who essentially she doesn't feel pain. She is never anxious. She is never depressed. As far as we can tell, that she goes through life animated by information-sensitive gradients of well-being. Bit of a mouthful, but that's absolutely,
cool.
Absolutely critical. And she is socially responsible. She has insight. She wants to help other people who have what seems to be a unique double genetic mutation, the far and the far out gene, that means she has abnormally high levels of anandamide, Sanskrit for bliss.
Yeah.
Sadly, it would be extremely premature to start talking of creating new babies, all of whom had her dual mutation. It might well be that whereas men tend to be greater risk takers, and whereas if you're living in Scotland in a very sheltered environment, you can get away with having her unusual condition that males who are born with an congenital insensitivity to pain quite frequently come to sticky ends, probably because testosterone is associated with risk taking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So essentially, many more studies need to be done of today's genetic outliers. And if one is looking further ahead, I can imagine a transhumanist civilization of, let's say, if today is -10 to 0 to +10 hedonic range, you're having +70 to a +100, i.e. more hedonic diversity, but tomorrow's hedonic floor being higher than our hedonic seeding. But that's much, much further into the future. I think our first priority is to create a hyperthymic civilization in which, we have got rid of most of all the nasty forms of suffering that we see today, but perhaps there are still minor forms and hedonic dips. And in principle, at any rate, thanks to the revolution, not just CRISPR genome editing, but less well-known potential revolution now in synthetic gene drives, it should be possible to reprogram the biosphere and spread the revolution to the rest of the living world.
Yeah. So.
Sorry, gene drives, I should probably just, if anyone doesn't, gene drives keep the laws of Mendelian inheritance. So if you've got a benign low-pain gene, for example, it's possible to spread that gene, if it's a sexually reproducing organism, quite rapidly across an entire species.
Right, we've talked about that before, yeah. So isn't there a kind of promotional, educational challenge here, in that most people, if you ask them what they would like to change in their life, are not going to say, I want complete absence of pain. And yet you presume that in the world of the future, people will know that that is the big thing that they want and that they can have, right? But probably most people don't naturally come to that conclusion today.
Yeah, I think most people would like, in some sense, the right to feel sad, but just not to feel sad. And this so often the debate seems to assume that it's an either-or, whereas transhumanism at its best, it's all-inclusive, and there's this idea that no one should be forced to suffer against their will.
Yeah.
It's this curiously persistent, this belief that someone, somewhere, if we do develop these technologies, is really going to compel you to be happy, which runs against everything we know from human history.
Right.
But one should always stress the voluntary, the freedom, the empowerment. And it
no one will be forced to be happy.
Suffering is the biology of suffering is coercive.
Right. Okay, well, let's get some students up here interrogating you. So, do you want to go first, or do you not want to go first? Come on up and ask some questions.
All right.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
My name's Cole. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate student here at the U of A. Studying computing science. So the idea of transhumanism, it's definitely really interesting. You were talking earlier about comedians in particular, and how adjusting pain won't adjust comedy. But when I look at comedians in particular, most of them come from really particularly dark backgrounds. A lot of them grow up in abusive households, and a lot of comedians do say that the pain helps them create comedy. So do you think there is a big distinction between those two, and do you think if we remove certain parts of our human background, are we going to be able to retain the things that make us human?
I mean, the question, will we truly be human, is some kind of sees essentialism. I think it's probably most relevant to ask what aspects of human nature as it exists today do we want to conserve? In terms of motivation, if someone's great motivation, joy in life is making people laugh, then other things being equal, being more motivated is going to amplify this. There's this distinction between, which is only relatively recent that its neurological basis has been teased out, between the hedonic tone and motivation. And you can, with the mu opioid receptor in our ultimate hedonic hotspot mediating hedonic tone, very crudely, there are other hotspots too, and the metalimbic dopamine system mediating motivation and drive. And so, although we can't yet precisely fine-tune the levels of each, nonetheless it should be possible to ratchet up both hedonic tone and motivation. I haven't properly answered your question because I'm honest, I haven't actually thought in depth about the nature of transhuman and post-human humour. I would imagine that in principle, that if one can actually identify the molecular signature of mirth in the brain, it should be possible to enrich and amplify it, and it might well be that transhuman and post-human jokes and humour will be superhumanly funny to an extent that it just simply isn't physiologically feasible today. And one could say the same thing of beauty too, for example. But I'll be honest, I haven't thought about your question as regards comedians in depth. Possibly because comedy doesn't play a very significant role in my life, sad to say.
The idea I read through your Wikipedia page, so it seems really interesting, the idea of transhumanism and the removal of pain. Is definitely super interesting. A world with no pain seems like a paradise. So it's a very interesting concept, and I'm happy to sit here and learn more about it. And does anyone else have a question they'd come up and ask?
Sure.
Go on. All right. Thanks talking to you.
I'm Hannah. I'm a master's student with the Department of Surgery.
Hi.
So my question is, if we have a world without pain, what is that going to do for grief and stuff when people lose someone or something happens in their life where most people would be in pain or going through grief? Would that no longer exist? I don't know if that's a good question or not, but
yeah, it's a very good question. Two parts to my answer. First, which is a bit of a cop-out, which seemed a bit of a cop-out, that transhumanists believe in defeating the biology of aging in the long term with opt-out cryonics, and I would say opting cryeuthanasia as an option. But given that we don't yet know how to defeat aging, as you say, it would seem something obscene, that something terrible happens to one of your loved ones, and you kind of carry on partying, so to speak. But back to what I was saying with Kim a few moments ago, one of the advantages of ratcheting up hedonic set points and hedonic range is that one can preserve empathy, social responsibility and social cognition. And sure, if I were to encounter any misfortune, or I were to walk under the proverbial bus or experience some terrible affliction, I think I'm entitled to want this to diminish the well-being of friends and family, but I don't think I'm entitled to want them to suffer on my account. And that's a critical distinction. And perhaps, some people would want the world to go into mourning if they suffered some terrible misfortune. But I would, how should I put this? That it would rob all relationships of any kind of meaning if we were just indiscriminately happy. That's one of the arguments against taking heroin. That even if it were possible to have safe, sustainable opioids that didn't show tolerance, that essentially heroin makes people emotionally self-sufficient. It robs relationships of their meaning. Whereas if we ratchet up hedonic set points, one can be still having relationships with their ups and downs and all the rest of it, and yet at the same time, generically, life is wonderful in the way that sadly so many of our relationships aren't wonderful today. And this is, the hedgehog's dilemma. Where we hurt most of the way that those we love most. It's so often relationships are tragic. Much more could be said. Sorry if I've only scratched the surface there.
That was a good answer. My other question is kind of a different direction, but that lady in Scotland, how many people are there like that in the world? Do you know?
Her specific double mutation is, as far as we know to date, unique. It hadn't been spotted before. Perhaps the best known mutation involving congenital insensitivity to pain is the SCN9A gene, which has dozens of different mutations, nonsense mutations, abolish any kind of capacity physically to suffer at all, other mutations, unusually high or low pain thresholds. But in the case of Joe Cameron, the FAR mutation was known before. People who had the relevant mutation tend to be less anxious, elevated pain thresholds, and so forth. But her second mutation, what has been christened as the FAR out gene, which regulates FAR, it was unknown. It was thought this was a pseudo gene. And since her case was quite rightly reported, there have been a fair number of other people around the world who have reported similar conditions. And there's obviously, I think that there needs to be a lot more research. But essentially we're reaching the position where all future babies could in principle be CRISPR babies, and we're going to be able to choose the level of pain sensitivity. And this is incredibly ethically challenging in a way, because whereas now something like 1 in 7 kids here in the UK ends up in casualty each year. Kids have accidents, generally it's not too serious, but pain does have this signalling mechanism. As soon as we do start choosing the level of pain sensitivity of our children, when there is an accident, you'll get some mother saying, evil scientist murdered my baby. I mean, imagine if you were choosing the dial settings for hedonic tone and pain sensitivity, what dial settings would you choose? Some difficult ethical dilemmas here. Just one point I thought I might mention too, very topical. The only time in her life Joe Cameron ever apparently felt really sick was when, quite unsolicited, she was given a dose of morphine. It seems to be that indirectly, as a result of her elevated anandamide levels, that possibly her body is flooded with endogenous opioids, or at least this is speculative, but it may be that she has some kind of resistance to opioid abuse, which is very topical in a North American context.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Saloni, and I'm also a student within the Department of Surgery. My question is maybe moving in a bit of a different direction. Currently, when you look at euthanasia in our current society, it's pretty heavily regulated. There are a lot of hoops that you need to jump through, and one of these hoops is that you have to be looking at death imminently. And so I was wondering, in a world where the goal is to eliminate all kind of pain and suffering, do you think these kinds of regulations would change? That it would be more readily available? Or I guess, to put in another way, if you don't choose to be born, should you really have to be here if you don't want to be?
Yes. Something like 850,000 people each year take their own lives, which is just the tip of a complete iceberg of emotional misery.
Right.
Euthanasia is extremely thorny, and I think it has to be exceptionally tightly regulated, because otherwise so many people will just feel that they're a burden on their loved ones and society. But as I would see it, that as we essentially phase out the biology of depression and pain and suffering, that essentially no one will want to take their own life. That one of the characteristics, if one is temperamentally extremely happy, is that life is self-intimatingly worth living. And often this distinction is drawn between happiness and meaning. And someone like Jordan Peterson will stress that what is important is not getting rid of suffering, but creating meaning. But other things being equal, the happier one becomes, the more meaningful and significant and purposeful life is. And so, as I would see it, that we're going to be moving later this century optimistically, less optimistically next century and beyond, into a world in which no one ever would even consider taking their own life, or wanting others to help them to take their own life. Yes, I sometimes say that I think the world's last unpleasant experience below hedonic zero, perhaps several centuries hence, there will equally be the date of the world's last suicide.
Interesting.
So with other aspects to your question, did I cover them? You were touching on being born, natalism versus antinatalism, or wasn't that central?
Yeah, a little.
Apologies if I didn't.
It wasn't the central point of the question, but I guess it was a little bit on the outside. That we don't choose life, and so given that we don't choose that, can we then choose death? But I guess if every person is able to find meaning and happiness, then hopefully there will be a need for them to want to choose death.
Yes, in recent years there has been a growth of antinatalism. I mean, this is one theoretical way, naively at any rate, to solve the problem of suffering is simply to stop having children. And if one somehow extends this to the rest of the living world, well, no more suffering.
Right.
However, the nature of selection pressure means that hard extinctionist antinatalism can never work. I think all that happens if one chooses not to have kids, not to bring more suffering into the world, is to intensify selection pressure against any predisposition to antinatalism. So, yeah, if we're ethically serious about suffering, I think we need to tackle its biological, genetic roots. The future, for better or worse, belongs to fanatical life lovers.
So then, in your opinion, there isn't really any value to this antenatal movement?
I think there is value to it. Someone like David Benatar, who has perhaps done more than anyone to highlight the ethical case for antinatalism. It's value. I mean, I personally wouldn't feel it is ethically justifiable to bring any more suffering into the world. I think it's a rather dark view of life that humans are Darwinian malware.
Right.
But I don't agree with his extinctionist conclusion. It's simply not viable.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So,
I did.
Hello.
Hi, my name's Rebecca, and I am a first-year medical student here at the University of Alberta while studying medicine. So my question kind of brings it back to the question of pain. So I view pain as good in the sense that it is necessary to develop the individual and to develop societies. While on one hand you have total lack of pain as maybe preventing experience from being gained, and on the other hand, you have too much pain, you could cause burnout, depression, wars, violence, etc. So in the middle there, I think there's just the right amount of pain that is good for overcoming adversity and coming out more resilient. And I think that is absolutely necessary for communities and individuals to thrive and to progress. So what are your thoughts on getting rid of pain altogether and kind of impeding humankind and mankind progressing forward?
Yes, it's tempting now for me to launch into sweeping generalizations. Sometimes pain can perform a valuable information signaling role, and there's certain kinds of pain, as we know, neuropathic pain, that are completely functionless, but yes, pain evolved for a reason. But the question is not, I think, whether it's not whether pain can sometimes be instructive. The question is it functionally indispensable? Are the raw fields of pain and suffering and its different varieties, do they play an indispensable computational functional role, or can we switch to a more civilized signaling system? And looking at the growth of computing and AI, and as we see artificial intelligence software programs outperforming humans in ever more cognitive domains, AI has witnessed this kind of divorce of consciousness from intelligence. And whatever functional role one sees different forms of suffering playing, I think we need to decide whether to keep the raw fields, whether to mitigate them, or in some cases whether to get rid of them altogether. Now, in terms of resilience and strength of character, people will often, quote Nietzsche, that which does not crush me makes me stronger. But contrary to what one might imagine, who are actually the strongest people psychologically, the most tough-minded? They're not, sadly, depressives. Depression is associated with subordination, defeat, learned helplessness, just giving up. The people with, crudely speaking, the strongest characters tend to be those who are highest on the hedonic scale. In pathological forms, you get something like euphoric mania, where people who have euphoric mania can achieves seemingly superhuman feats of endurance, but in a more benign, controlled way. Essentially, people who have very naturally high pain tolerance, high hedonic set point, they are in many ways stronger people. So, but essentially, I think this is it. People should be free to choose, and that's the critical thing. I don't think one has any right to impose suffering or the genetic biological substrates of suffering on others. If one wants to suffer or the right to suffer oneself, this should be respected first. That's it.
Okay, thank you.
Feel free to come back. You don't need to agree with this.
A lot of complicated thoughts right now. Okay, anybody else?
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello there. My name is Amir. I'm a second year classics student. Maybe less so a question, but just something I want to touch upon. About earlier, you mentioned a sort of paradox between people want to be sad, but also not sad at the same time. And my take on that is that I think people are gradually incredibly more selfish with in regards to wants in life. So yeah, I don't really have a question, but if you could maybe expand more on maybe the paradox of pain.
The paradox of why that people hate suffering and yet in many cases say that they wouldn't want to lose this capacity.
Right.
It's difficult. I think status quo bias comes into this a lot. This sense that a world in which there was no pain and suffering and miserable was in some sense unnatural. But I don't have a full explanation. Partly I think it's simply that one wants to rationalize the bad things that have happened to one, just the nastiness of life, and saying that all the suffering someone has gone through is in some sense meaningless and a waste, somehow to cheapen someone's life. But as to whether there is any kind of intrinsic value to suffering, as I said, as a way of undercutting status quo bias, I'd often pose the thought experiments. Imagine we do encounter an advanced civilization that has abolished any form of suffering in favour of gradients of bliss. Would we urge them to reintroduce jealousy, resentment, depression, anxiety, all the nastiness of Darwinian life that was adaptive, fitness enhancing for our genes, even though it's bad for us? But what arguments would one use to this advanced alien civilization to persuade them to reintroduce the horrors of their ancestral past? And I think they would think of us as suffering from some kind of depressive psychosis. And I also think they'd be right.
Right. Yeah. In regards to the course as a whole, we spend a lot of time discussing advancements and whatnot, and what will happen when AI kind of takes over, or whatnot. And unfortunately, I'm a pretty big pessimist when it comes to all of this. And I just feel like the human race as a whole is kind of indecisive. And what I mean by that is that I think that we'd like something like AI to take over the day-to-day tasks of our lives, but I don't think we'd appreciate them taking over everything, and then we just don't get to experience life as a whole. And it's.
I'd agree with you there. That there's an ambiguity when one talks about superintelligence, post-human superintelligence. People are using the term in different senses, as you know. I mean, there are some sort of Kurzweilians, the singularity is near, that humans are going to fuse with our machines, or perhaps mind uploading. Then there is the so-called intelligence explosion scenario associated with I.J. Good, Miri, and most recently Nick Bostrom in superintelligence. But there is another conception of post-human superintelligence, and one that personally I take most seriously, in which post-human superintelligence will essentially be us, or rather our genetically rewritten and AI-enhanced descendants. As far as I can tell, you can have narrow superintelligence and a chip. So anything that our machines, classical digital computers can do, you can do with embedded neurochips. But unlike our machines, you are a unitary subjective experience. So you can become, in a sense, or rather, your successor, a full spectrum superintelligence, as distinct from what is sometimes called superintelligence today.
Yeah, I can see where good would come from that, but at the same time, I just don't think anybody would really appreciate that at the end of the day. This unlimited potential of experiencing and intelligence and.
Well, I mean, in this bit, why do we want superintelligence? It's which is a good question. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, intelligence or anything else only matters insofar as it bears on the well-being or ill-being of sentience, of minds, whether they're humble or gigantic. Now, the technologies involved in phasing out suffering, one needn't invoke post-human superintelligence. One can simply actually point to recognizable extensions of existing technologies, whether genome editing, cross-species amino contraception, cultured meat, and so forth. But I think, in the sense, superintelligence is coming, but it's just, I don't think our machines are going to wake up, as is sometimes supposed.
All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, a lot of your ideas have to do with removing the randomness of life. Like, right now, when we conceive a child, there's tremendous, it's sort of like shaking the dice, but with so many possibilities, right? And like, if we are able to plan our offspring, if we are able to control pain and so on, it does, like when you read basic texts through the ages about right and wrong and morality, this is going to change everything, not necessarily in a bad way, but so how does this connect to free will? Do you believe in free will? Do you and I, we think we're making decisions? Do you think we really are, or is this all a sort of deterministic world and we're just fooling ourselves? And how would the changes that you foresee influence that? Would they influence free will?
Yes, it depends how deeply and philosophically one wants to go into the issue of free will. I mean, one could, answer as a physicist might answer that there's only the continuous, linear, unitary, deterministic evolution of the universal wave function, and that free will is incoherent. But in the popular sense, in which I raise my hand now and I chose to do so, then there is in that popular sense there is free will, and I don't think precision engineering our reward circuitry or our physical health is going to deprive us of freedom, liberty in this second popular colloquial sense. On the contrary, I think it's going to be tremendously empowering. After all, if one is physically healthy, and I very much hope that we're going to phase out the biology of aging, this is empowering. One can do far more things. If one if one is choosing the genetic dial settings of one's future offspring and ensures high motivation, high hedonic set point, extreme physical, emotional, intellectual health, rather than in some sense constraining a child's future life, one is magnifying opportunities. And that so many people today, let's say, because of low mood, subclinical, clinical depression, essentially that they don't have the opportunity to do all the kinds of things that would be really wonderful. If you, once again, looking at today's hedonic outliers, they get so much more out of life, and it wasn't, that by at the moment it's a fortunate throw of the genetic dice, but in future we can load the dice. I know I sometimes probably come across as a naive, crude genetic determinist, and of course it's much more complicated than that. Genes of culture co-evolved, but even making just a few modest genetic tweaks, we could create a hyperthymic civilization in which essentially everyone can enjoy life to the full. Okay, I'm glossing over 1,000,001 complications, but as a society, as a civilization, I think we need to have a debate over this. I mean, since I was last chatting to you and your students, we've had the first CRISPR babies in China. Not ideal circumstances. I don't think the full story has yet been told. I suspect the scientist in question, rather than trying to protect kids from HIV, was actually conducting an experiment to have essentially smart babies, because the particular gene deletion in question, coincidentally, in animal models and probably also in humans too, actually enhances cognitive function. And almost certainly, essentially trying to create smart babies. And although I'm most certainly, in the long run, in favour not just of extremely emotionally happy, healthy kids, I would also favour, extremely intelligent children. I don't think it should be done in this kind of surreptitious, illicit ways. I don't think it's going to be possible to ratchet up intelligence really in the way that this Chinese scientist was doing. I mean, and our conception of intelligence is in any case, incredibly impoverished. You still get these so-called IQ tests, which really measure the autistic dimension of intelligence, and other things being equal, if you get prospective parents trying to select to have high IQ babies, then essentially you're not going to have high IQ kids, you're going to have high AQ kids, which is not to be disrespectful of the people who are high on the Asperger's spectrum, but one needs to have a debate as what is to the optimal AQ of society as well as the IQ.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Given the sudden backlash against the China CRISPR babies, what would be your suggestion in terms of implementation for doing this kind of genetic research? Because there's a lot of resistance in, like North America and Europe in designer babies or genetic editing or any research in that direction. So while the research in China was a big step forward in actually carrying out that kind of research, there was so much backlash, and so do you think that there is place for that research to be done, and how do you think that would happen?
The backlash is quite complicated. I suspect, to be rather cynical, that a lot of the moral hyperventilation was a lot of scientists were just extremely envious of the fame and glory of the scientist in question, in that essentially all kids at the moment are untested genetic experiments,
Right.
and this is considered ethically acceptable. And if you do think it is ethically acceptable to conduct these genetic experiments, then I don't really see that, there is any case to be made against trying to load the genetic dice. But yeah, what's going to happen presumably is that the first, and I think we're going to think of a better label than designer babies, essentially what's going to be treated first are or prevented the well-known genetic diseases, Tay-Sachs, Huntington's, cystic fibrosis, and so forth, rather than a predisposition to depression or a low pain threshold. But I think this is unfortunate because the quality of life of people who are depressed, for example, is in many cases far worse than the quality of life of someone with cystic fibrosis.
Right.
And yeah, the circumstances in which the revolution of designer babies is going to play out, tremendously complicated. But if one takes seriously, the World Health Organization's founding constitution, its definition of health as complete emotional, physical, social well-being, I think that's for anything too ambitious. I would say information-sensitive gradients of well-being. But we can only have a world in which everyone essentially does enjoy lifelong health via this biological genetic interventions.
So do you think there was, sorry, go ahead.
No?
Do you think there was anything morally questionable about what was done in China, or are you in support of that?
Sorry, the audio is good. Could you possibly repeat the question? Sorry.
Do you think that the China research was morally questionable, or are you in support of that kind of research?
No, I don't support what the scientist in question did because I don't think he was being
Honest.
straight. Well, this is my suspicion. I could be doing him a terrible injustice. He may have been primarily motivated by trying to protect these babies from getting HIV. But my very strong hunch is that he knew what he was doing, and we don't know the full story. And but in terms of where I would place on a scale of moral turpitude what the scientist in question did, well, I would, regard, something like eating meat as far worse. I mean, people are extremely selective what they get morally indignant about. I think it's good if we have a serious ethical and bioethical debate, but too often we focus on the wrong issues.
Yeah. When you taught in the course before, I had a diet including meat, and during the period that you weren't teaching, I was quite convinced by a lot of transhumanist leaders who point out that when machines are smarter than we are, they will really look down on us eating meat. So anyway, I became vegetarian in 2018.
Oh, fantastic!
And you were just one of multiple voices, but I guess the interaction with you was part of the cause of that. But I was looking at some of your previous videos with us, and actually your parents were also vegetarian. So, I mean, it was a very natural thing.
It's nice of them to birth. This is it. We've had no personal inconvenience on my part, and if someone were to reveal that coffee, for example, was produced by some form of animal exploitation, and would I come up with some tortured justification as to why I needed to keep on drinking coffee? You know, this is, yeah, it's an accident of birth. But having said that, yeah, if one's never tasted meat, the kind of spurious rationalizations people come up with, yes, yeah, it's pretty dreadful, and heaven knows what we'll tell our grandchildren or great nephews and nieces if we don't have kids.
Yeah. Okay. So the autism Asperger's spectrum people, do you favor trying to deal with that through genetic engineering, or is that actually a feature rather than a bug? Is it maybe, since so many creative people have had that sort of difference in the way their brain works, you think it's something we should get rid of, or how do you feel about Asperger's?
In terms of many people with, let's say, bipolar disorders associated with any forms of artistic creativity, whereas unipolar depressives, on the whole, don't tend to achieve, inverted commas, a great deal. People with bipolar disorder, although it can be absolutely excruciating in the depressive phase, can, yeah, great art, literature. In the case of people who are high on the Asperger's syndrome, from Newton to Dirac to Perelman, to you name it, yeah, there is there seems to be this poorly understood neurological trade-off between the different cognitive styles. And as I said, I have to be quite careful, because I sometimes find myself speaking rather dismissively of autistic, the autistic component of intelligence. It's absolutely critical, not least this ability to be a hyper-systematizer. That I hope that we can eradicate suffering throughout the living world. And this doesn't bespeak compassion. This was not particularly compassion. It speaks a hyper-systematizing impulse. So what would be best, of course, is this capacity to switch between one cognitive style and another.
Yes.
But
to have a choice.
Yeah. But in doing so, would it actually, make one, if one is a brilliant mathematician, if one became, more, shall we say, empathetically oriented in one's cognitive style, would this actually reduce one's brilliance as a mathematician? And I've known one or two, friends, colleagues, transhumanists, my good friend Andres from Stanford Transhumanist Creative Research. Yeah, he was a Mexican maths Olympiad, but yeah, he's also unusually empathetic too. But this is it. If he'd gone on being, a pure mathematician, would he be a Fields medalist, as distinct from, a mediocre Mexican maths Olympiad? I don't know. This is it. The actual neurological basis of the trade-offs isn't understood. I mean, if I were trying to develop full spectrum superintelligence, I would probably be recursively cloning von Neumann's, buried in crypto, as we know, with a few variations, hot outing the products and so forth. But even von Neumann, a prodigious polymath, wouldn't say that he is especially, shall we say, empathetic intelligence. He favoured preemptive strikes on Russia, for example. Anyway, I digress. Sorry.
So wouldn't this be a new field of study that we can design a future society, and right now there are a million different ideas of what should be prioritized, what enhancements should be allowed, which ones shouldn't, and so on. But do you feel that this is something where you could put science behind it and say, okay, we're going to get this group of smart people to come up with guidelines, right? Guidelines for a future genetically inhered. Doesn't that sound like something like what the Nazis and other bad people did? So how can we put some science behind this and keep it something positive and favorable?
Okay, I'm slightly disconcerted by the Nazis, but fair enough. This is the thing. Hitler and the Nazis did not set out to be evil, even though, what they did was monstrous. You won't understand the Third Reich or race hygiene policy of the Third Reich by thinking, Nazi doctors set out to be evil. Best I can say is that if we do decide to phase out the biology and the genetics of suffering or involuntary suffering, then the nature of things going wrong will change. Sure, there is a risk of ending up with a suboptimal utopia if we get rid of suffering, but let's say as a result of getting rid of suffering, we somehow stunt future opportunities for growth or cosmic exploration or something like this. I don't know, possibly, this is it. My fundamental value, it's Buddhist suffering-focused ethics. I see as this overwhelming moral urgency in getting rid of suffering. And because I have this incredibly dark view of life and suffering, I am less focused on the risk of things being merely a suboptimal utopia rather than a true utopia, whatever that might be.
Yeah. What I hear you saying is maybe we don't need to study what the goals should be. Maybe we already know them. Maybe the past 2,000 years of human beings writing what they're looking for in life, that's what should guide us. And we don't need specific new guidelines. Then we just need somehow a kind of plan of action. Like if we decide to do this, where do we start? Who does it apply to? Is it worldwide, or where in the world does it start?
We need I'm going to mispronounce her name, but we need a Greta. How do you pronounce this? Greta Thunberg.
We do.
Her name, essentially to harangue the United Nations and and the World Health Organization for failing to live up to its statutory obligation to promote the health of all people, or as I would like to say, of all sentient beings. Technically, it would be possible to have a 100-year plan. Whether it would take 95 or 105 years, I don't know, but it would be possible to construct a 100-year plan to phase out the biology of suffering. Incredibly ambitious and grandiose, but I think it's technically feasible. One could draw up blueprints even now. But of course, sociologically, it's unrealistic. For a start, everyone would have to agree that they wouldn't just have babies in the traditional route, but to go for pre-implantation, genetic screening, counselling, CRISPR, you name it. But nonetheless, I would favour this as a goal for our society and our civilization. Now, I mean, I haven't personally got the strength of character or personality to take this forward, but I think it's going to happen. There will be breakthroughs, but it's not just technical breakthroughs that are needed.
Right.
It's going to be sociological breakthroughs, political breakthroughs, and being a politician takes a very, very different set of skills than being a writer, philosopher, research scientist, medical researcher.
Yeah.
Transhumanism has branched out now into the political realm, and not merely in the United States, for example, as there is a transhumanist party. There is also a transhumanist candidate for the Republican Party, Zoltan Istvan.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is a very, very different set of skills is called for. I mean, my natural approach, and that's, I suppose it's true of quite a lot of writers, is put something in the public domain, I hope it's luminously self-evident and wait to, but in practice, of course, one has to argue and agitate and deal with a lot of flack in the process. So yeah, I would love to be telling your students and indeed the rest of the world of my
Grand plan for the next 100 years?
But sadly, essentially I'm a writer who can just occasionally do a bit of talking.
Right. No, this has been a very good conversation with you, and I thank you for that. So David Wood, you must have come into contact with him. He's also in the kind of political sphere within the UK. At least his writing does include politics, and so it is. And so Shauna Pandya, who's speaking in 2 days here, she has a presentation on the next 100 years, and it includes a major revolution of women getting together and just seeing the terrible things that men are doing and sort of setting it right, and that's an exciting part in her. So let's talk about that. I mean, we've talked in previous videos about the theoretical, advantage of having women in charge of everything, but let's talk about fixing these adverse male, tendencies, like the territoriality of males. Is that something that you think is basically genetic and would be fixable, or is there no solution to the fact that male leaders want to have more territory and women don't seem to do that, or only in extreme situations that can be explained in other ways?
Yes, I mean, this is it. How do young men and not so young men spend their time recreationally, whether it's competitive sports or video games, and the kinds of video games they enjoy tend to involve battle, conflict, territorial aggression.
Yeah.
And I blush to say, one of my main pleasures in life is playing modern combat versus. I'll spend goodness knows how much time. Yeah, sure, I am vegan, pacifist, and clan herbivores, but nonetheless, essentially, it involves competing with your allies to shoot members of the enemy to control the zone. This is just as
I didn't know that about you.
Incredibly primitive.
Yeah.
If you're getting people who are officially, kind of vegan, pacifists and so on like this, then yeah, it is bound up in some sense with testosterone and the male psyche, and sure, genes and culture co-evolve. But nonetheless, yeah, what is the optimal level of testosterone function? How masculinized in traditional sense of masculinized do we want our brains? And undoubtedly, some of the most brilliant mathematicians, theoretical physicists, and so forth, essentially, and I know this can sound incredibly sexist, essentially, hyper-masculine brains. I mean, there aren't any really kind of world-class chess players, very, very few really top-rated theoretical physicists. But the crude ways that one could change this are ridden with pitfalls. I think it's fantastic. Progress in the women's movement. There's getting away from binary gender, gay rights, and so forth. Yet nonetheless, definitely these biological genetic influences are real, and increasingly they're going to be manipulable.
Yeah. Okay.
On the whole, I try to avoid getting too closely into my personal conception of what is the kind of the ideal society. Obviously, I do have my own ideas, but by focusing on simply the ratcheting upwards of hedonic set points and hedonic ranges, in dodging these issues, and I could outline my version of paradise, but it wouldn't resonate with a lot of people. In that sense, it's not critical to getting rid of suffering.
Yes. Well, I would like to keep doing sessions with you in future iterations of the course. I think this is good for the students. And so do any of you have further questions you want to ask? Okay, well, it's getting late for you, so thank you for a very successful teaching session, and we'll look forward to the next time. So, anyway.
Once again, thank you, you and your students. Any follow-ups, feel free. People can email if they're frustrated that I didn't answer or what have you. But otherwise, yes, I look forward to interacting online in our next teaching session, wherever that is.
Excellent. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good night. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about Thursday. I'm afraid in some of what I've been writing about the coronavirus and stuff, you guys may think that this dinner at the revolving restaurant is going to be the most dismal down. But it won't be. It'll be happy and fun, and Shauna's really cool to spend time with and so on. So, furthermore, I've kind of already made the decisions. So it's. I thought we were going to be in the circumstance where the students who were planning to go to France and I were still be kind of negotiating about whether they're going, but I just don't think it's safe. I mean, if they've closed the Louvre, they've outlawed large meetings throughout the country, and like there's no city that is completely free, and they're like the number of cases doubles every day and so on. I can't send students in a circumstance like that. So anyway, what we'll be doing instead, like Amir and the other students who have already been there, I think we need to create a video about what it's like there, and just because now by the time students end up going there again, they may not know you personally, right? That some of you guys, because it'll probably be at least 4 to 6 months before the situation normalizes, you know, and so on. Like, people in France are saying they've never known something like this, you know, that it is more severe and quite different from any sort of pandemic that they've encountered. Similarly, I was going to, as you know, I was going to be in Abu Dhabi at the time of your midterm exam. Now I'm going to be in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, because it's not safe to go to Abu Dhabi. So they haven't canceled the meeting yet, but I think that they probably will. Yeah. Anyway, so no, it'll be fun, and I think Shauna's previous presentations were sort of leading up to the one that she's giving on Thursday, which you'll find more engaging, more exciting stuff than the previous ones. And yeah, it is also interesting, if you look at the viewership, the number of views that the videos from the course have, it's clearly motivated by other things rather than just the quality of, you know, the information. Like, I have always felt that Shauna is absolutely one of our best teachers, but from the course videos, some of the videos go up above 100 views, but you know, not anywhere near the 5,000 or 6,000 that we have for Jonathan Schaefer and Jack Tazinski. I don't know, it's just something about what causes huge numbers of people to watch the videos. So I think that's also true. Like, I was realizing of all the links that I sent you on David Pearce, they're all like, they max out at 100 views, 150. So yeah, it isn't like they went viral, but some of the information, like I thought, am I wasting time watching these videos again? And I thought, no, I can't make the students watch them, and I don't watch them because then I won't know. Yeah, and some of them are really good. I mean, when we were talking about this question about whether life is significant without struggle, right? That's a really important question, because to some extent pain is associated with struggle, right? But so much of what we do, struggle is an important part of it. And we had a long, in-depth discussion of that in 2015. And many other things. So, okay, any questions then, or suggestions for improvement, anything? Do you think I still should send the students to France? I don't think so. None of you think that. Be a forced march. No one else is going there, but they still need to go there. No, that would not be a benign approach to things. Okay, so we'll see you on Thursday, and thanks so much. Yeah.